There was once a man who had spent 10 long years fighting far from home. His name was Odysseus, king of the small island of Ithaca, a man known not only for his strength, but for his patience, his intelligence, and his ability to survive when strength alone was no longer enough. The great war at Troy was finally over. For 10 years, the Greeks had fought before the walls of that ancient city. Men had crossed the sea believing they would return as heroes, but many never saw their homes again. The war had taken husbands from wives, fathers from children, and friends from those who had grown old waiting for them. And now Troy had fallen. The famous city, once protected by enormous walls and defended by its warriors, had finally been defeated. The Greek ships were preparing to leave the coast, their sails waiting for the winds that would carry the survivors back across the sea. Among those ships was the vessel of Odysseus. For the first time in many years, the road before him seemed simple. Home. Ithaca was waiting. Somewhere beyond the wide blue waters was a small island surrounded by rocky shores and quiet hills. There, his wife Penelope waited. There, his young son Telemachus had grown up while his father was away. And there was the house that Odysseus had left behind before the war. He had no idea that the journey home would become almost as difficult as the war itself. At the beginning, Odysseus could not have known how many years still separated him from Ithaca. He could not have known that storms would scatter his ships, that strange islands would appear from the mist, or that he would encounter beings whose names would survive for thousands of years. He could not have known that he would stand before a giant Cyclops, descend into the realm of the dead, hear the voices of the Sirens, pass between terrifying monsters, and spend years imprisoned, far from the people he loved. He knew only that the war was finished. And so the ships departed from Troy. The sea stretched endlessly around them. The men had been fighting for so long that peace itself felt unfamiliar. Their weapons were still beside them. Their ships still carried the marks of war, but the sounds of battle had disappeared. Now there was only the rhythm of the oars. Wood moved against water. The sails caught the wind. The coastline of Troy slowly disappeared behind them. For Odysseus, every mile across the sea seemed to bring him closer to Ithaca. But the ancient Greeks believed that the sea was never simply a road. It was a world of its own. Beyond the familiar coastlines were islands that sailors rarely visited, waters that could change without warning, and places where the boundary between the human world and the world of the gods seemed very thin. Odysseus was about to enter that world, and perhaps the greatest danger was not the sea itself. It was the anger of the gods. During the war, Odysseus had earned both admiration and resentment among the immortals. His cleverness had helped the Greeks win, but cleverness could become arrogance, and the gods of the ancient world were not always kind toward mortal pride. Among them was Poseidon, lord of the sea. Odysseus would eventually give Poseidon a reason to remember his name. But for now, the voyage began peacefully. The ships moved across the Aegean waters as the sun descended toward the horizon. The men watched the fading light and imagined their homes. Some thought of their wives. Some thought of their children. Some dreamed of fields they had not seen for years. And Odysseus thought of Ithaca. He had spent 10 years fighting to reach Troy. Now he would discover that returning home could require even greater patience. The first days of the voyage passed beneath open skies. The sea was calm, the winds were favorable, and for a little while it seemed possible that the journey would be easy. But the world of Odysseus was not a world in which heroes simply sailed home after their adventures. The gods had their own designs, and fate had already begun preparing the obstacles that would stand between Odysseus and Ithaca. Soon, the Greek ships would reach a strange coastline. The men would go ashore looking for food and supplies. They believed they had found a place where they could rest. Instead, they would discover their first warning that the journey home would not be peaceful. The land belonged to a people known as the Ciconies. At first, Odysseus and his men saw only a quiet settlement beside the sea. They did not know that their arrival would begin the first great disaster of their voyage. And they did not yet understand the lesson that would follow them throughout the entire Odyssey. A man may survive a war through courage and intelligence, but returning home requires something more. It requires knowing when to leave. And that was a lesson Odysseus was about to learn. The ships waited offshore. The men prepared to step onto the unfamiliar land. The journey home had begun, and somewhere beyond the horizon, Ithaca was waiting. The coastline appeared through the morning haze. After many days at sea, the men of Odysseus finally saw land ahead. It was not the land they had dreamed about. It was not Ithaca. But after years of war, even an unfamiliar shore could look inviting. The ships moved closer to the coast, their wooden hulls rising and falling gently with the waves. The men were tired. They had spent years surrounded by soldiers, weapons, walls, and death, and now they were eager for anything that might make the journey home easier. The land before them belonged to a people known as the Ciconies. Their settlement stood near the shore, surrounded by fertile fields and scattered houses. Beyond it were hills covered with vegetation, and further inland, the landscape disappeared into the distance. Odysseus looked toward the settlement. His men looked toward it too. They had food running low, supplies that needed replacing, and possessions taken during the war that could be exchanged or carried home. But there was another reason they were interested in the settlement. The Greeks had spent 10 years fighting. They had become accustomed to taking what they needed from enemy territory. And although Troy had fallen, the habits of war did not disappear the moment the fighting ended. Odysseus ordered his men to prepare their ships. The vessels were brought close to shore. The Greeks landed. At first, the people of the settlement were caught completely unprepared. The arrival of armed strangers from the sea was unexpected. Odysseus and his men attacked. The fighting was brief. The Ciconies were unable to organize their defense quickly enough, and the Greeks took control of the settlement. They gathered food, livestock, weapons, precious objects, and other supplies. Some of Odysseus's men wanted to leave immediately. They understood that the sea was still waiting for them. They understood that the sea was still waiting for them. They understood that the sea was still waiting for them. They understood that the sea was still waiting for them. They understood that the sea was still waiting for them. They understood that the sea was still waiting for them. They understood that the sea was still waiting for them. The Greeks had defeated Troy. They had survived years of fighting. Now, standing on this unfamiliar coast, they began to believe that perhaps nothing could stop them. Odysseus warned his men. He told them to return to the ships. They had taken enough. It was time to leave. But not everyone listened. Some of the men were enjoying the food and wine they had found. Others were celebrating their victory. They had been soldiers for so long that they wanted, perhaps more than anything, a moment when they could forget about danger. The ships waited on the shore. The sea was calm. The sun moved slowly across the sky. And still the men remained. It was a small decision. They would regret it. Farther inland lived more of the Ciconies. These people had escaped the first attack, and now they had time to prepare. They sent messengers into the surrounding country. Warriors began gathering. Men who had been scattered through nearby villages came together, armed and ready. By the time Odysseus realized what was happening, the situation had changed. The Greeks were no longer attacking an unprepared settlement. They were surrounded by an organized force. The sound of approaching warriors reached the coast. Odysseus's men rushed toward their weapons. The celebration ended. The quiet shore became a battlefield. The Ciconies attacked. The Greeks fought back. For a time, Odysseus and his men managed to hold their position. They had experienced warriors among them. They knew how to fight in formation. They knew how to use their shields and spears. But numbers began to matter. More Ciconies arrived. The Greeks were exhausted from the previous fighting. Some had been separated from their companions. Others had stayed too far inland. And now the enemy was pressing them toward the sea. Odysseus called for his men to retreat. The Greeks began running toward their ships. Some reached the vessels. Others were caught before they could escape. The beach filled with shouting. Men pulled ropes. Others pushed against the hulls. Oars struck the water. The ships began moving away from the shore, but the victory they had celebrated only hours earlier had become a terrible loss. Many of Odysseus's companions were dead. The men who survived looked back toward the land. They could see the shoreline growing smaller. The Ciconies remained there, and the Greeks sailed away. Odysseus had lost men because they had refused to leave when they had the chance. It was the first major lesson of his journey. The sea had not defeated them. A monster had not defeated them. A god had not yet destroyed them. They had been endangered by something much simpler. They had stayed too long. The voyage continued. The ships moved away from the coast and returned to the open sea. For some time, the men spoke little. The mood had changed. They had begun the journey believing that the worst was behind them. Now they understood that the road home could be dangerous. Still, Ithaca remained their destination. Odysseus continued to guide the fleet. He watched the winds. He watched the waves. He studied the sky. Every decision mattered. A favorable wind could shorten the journey. A storm could destroy a ship. A mistake could separate the fleet. And beyond all of this was the unknown. The men did not possess maps showing every island. They did not know what waited beyond each horizon. Their world was enormous, and the sea made it even larger. As the days passed, the weather began to change. The peaceful conditions they had enjoyed did not last. Clouds gathered. The wind shifted. The sea became darker. Odysseus looked toward the horizon. The sailors adjusted the sails. The ships moved through increasingly rough water. Then the storm arrived. Wind struck the sails. The ships tilted violently. Waves rose around the hulls. Men grabbed ropes and shouted instructions to one another. Rain swept across the deck. The sky disappeared behind dark clouds. The fleet struggled to remain together. The ships that had left Troy as a group were now being pushed in different directions. Odysseus could do little except hold on and try to survive. The storm continued. Hours passed, perhaps days. The sailors could no longer tell. The sea became a world of darkness and motion. Then, slowly, the storm began to weaken. The clouds opened. The waves became smaller, and once again, the men found themselves beneath an open sky. But when they looked around, something had changed. The fleet was no longer together. Ships had disappeared. The men could not see their companions. Odysseus's journey had entered a new stage. He was no longer simply leading an army home. He was becoming a wanderer. The sea carried him toward places that no Greek army had planned to visit. And eventually, after the storm and many days of uncertain sailing, Odysseus and his remaining companions reached another strange coast. They were hungry. They were exhausted. They had lost their way. And when they looked upon the people who lived there, they believed they had finally found somewhere peaceful. The inhabitants appeared harmless. They offered food. They welcomed the strangers. And there was something unusual about that food. It was made from a plant that grew naturally in the land. The people who ate it seemed to forget everything else. They forgot their homes. They forgot their families. They forgot that they had ever wanted to return anywhere. They were called the Lotus-Eaters, and the food they offered would become one of the most dangerous things Odysseus had encountered, because not every danger in the world of Odysseus came with a sword. Some dangers came disguised as comfort. The men of Odysseus had spent years dreaming of home, but now, on a quiet shore far from Ithaca, some of them were about to discover what it felt like to forget that dream completely. Odysseus watched his men approach the strangers. He did not yet understand what the lotus would do to them. He did not know that his next challenge would not be to defeat an enemy. It would be to convince his own men that they still wanted to go home. The journey continued, and Ithaca remained impossibly far away. The sea had finally become quiet again. The storm that had scattered Odysseus and his companions was behind them, but the memory of it remained. The men were tired. Their clothes were still damp from the rain. Their hands were sore from holding ropes through the violent waves, and their eyes were heavy from days of uncertainty. They had left Troy with the hope that every sunrise would bring them closer to Ithaca. Instead, the sea had carried them farther and farther from the path they had intended to follow. The coastline they now approached was unfamiliar. It stretched beneath a warm sky, with low hills rising beyond the shore and green vegetation spreading across the land. From the sea, the place looked peaceful. There were no walls, no armies, no towers filled with soldiers, no smoke rising from a battlefield. Only a quiet coast beneath the afternoon sun. Odysseus watched it carefully. After what had happened among the Cyclones, he had become more cautious. A peaceful shore did not necessarily mean a safe one. The sea had already taught him that appearances could be deceiving. Still, his men needed food. They needed fresh water. And after the storm, they needed somewhere to rest. Odysseus selected a small group of his companions. He instructed them to go ashore. Their task was simple. They were to discover who lived there. They were to find fresh water. They were to look for food. And above all, they were to learn whether the people of the land were friendly. The men stepped from the ship onto the shore. Their feet touched dry ground. For the first time in many days, they were not standing on a moving deck. They walked slowly inland. The sun was warm. The wind carried the scent of grass and flowers. Birds moved quietly through the trees. The landscape seemed almost untouched by war. The men continued walking. Soon they encountered the inhabitants. They were called the Lotus-Eaters. The people did not appear threatening. They did not raise weapons. They did not surround the Greeks. Instead, they welcomed the strangers. They spoke calmly. They offered food. And among the plants growing throughout the land was a strange fruit known as the lotus. The Greeks had never encountered anything quite like it. The Lotus-Eaters ate the plant regularly. To them, it was ordinary. They lived quietly. They did not seem interested in conquest. They did not speak about distant wars. They did not appear concerned with wealth, fame, or power. They simply lived. And that simplicity was part of the danger. One of Odysseus's men accepted the lotus. He tasted it. Nothing appeared to happen. The plant seemed harmless. Then another man tried it, and another. The sailors began to relax. The fear of the storm seemed to disappear. The exhaustion of the journey seemed to fade. The thought of Ithaca became less important. At first, Odysseus did not understand what was happening. He noticed that the men were no longer talking about the ships. They were no longer asking when they would leave. They were no longer discussing the road home. Instead, they simply sat among the Lotus-Eaters. They looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. One of the sailors smiled. He spoke about how beautiful the land was. Another said that perhaps they should remain there for a while. There was no reason to hurry. The sea was dangerous. The journey was exhausting. Why continue? Why return to a life of responsibility and struggle when they could remain here? Odysseus listened. He understood something was wrong. These were men who had spent years dreaming about home, men who had survived Troy because they believed that one day they would see their families again. Now they were willing to abandon everything. Not because they had decided that Ithaca no longer mattered, but because they had forgotten why they had wanted to return. The lotus had changed their desire. It had not frightened them. It had not wounded them. It had simply made them content to remain where they were. And for Odysseus, that was more dangerous than an enemy standing before him with a sword. A warrior can fight an enemy. But how do you fight forgetfulness? How do you fight the desire to stop moving? How do you convince a man that he has a home when he no longer remembers why home matters? Odysseus knew he could not allow his men to remain. He ordered them to return to the ships. They refused. Some laughed. Some tried to persuade him. They said the land was beautiful. They said the people were kind. They said there was no reason to continue suffering on the sea. Odysseus looked at them. These were his companions, men who had fought beside him, men who had crossed the battlefield at Troy, men who had trusted him with their lives, and now they were asking him to abandon the journey. He understood that reasoning would not be enough. The lotus had taken away their desire to return. So Odysseus acted. He and the men who had not eaten the lotus seized their companions. The affected sailors struggled. They did not want to leave. They clung to the ground. They called the land beautiful. They begged to remain. But Odysseus refused. He ordered the men to carry them back to the ships. Some had to be physically restrained. Others were dragged through the grass toward the shore. They cried out that they did not want to return to the sea. They wanted to stay. They wanted peace. They wanted the lotus. Odysseus did not listen. One by one, the sailors were brought back. The men who remained unaffected watched in silence. They understood now that the journey home had become something different. They were not simply traveling toward Ithaca. They were trying to preserve the memory of Ithaca itself. The ships waited offshore. The affected men were placed aboard. Some continued pleading. Some fell into silence. Others stared back toward the land with longing. Odysseus ordered the ropes released. The oars entered the water. The ships began moving. Slowly, the shore moved away. The green hills became smaller. The people of the land disappeared into the distance. And the men who had eaten the lotus continued looking backward. They wanted to return. Odysseus did not allow it. He knew that if they stayed, the journey would end there. Not with death, not with war, not with a storm, but with forgetting. The ships continued across the sea. For a while, nobody spoke. The men were thinking about what had happened. They had barely escaped the first great danger of the journey. And the strange thing was that the Lotus-Eaters had not wanted to hurt them. They had simply offered them something pleasant. That was enough. The world of Odysseus was beginning to reveal its deeper nature. Danger would not always look dangerous. Sometimes it would appear beautiful. Sometimes it would offer rest. Sometimes it would whisper that there was no reason to continue. And perhaps this was one of the greatest themes of Odysseus's journey. He wanted to go home, but the further he traveled, the more things appeared that could make him forget that purpose. The sea continued carrying the ships. Days passed. The men watched the horizon. They had survived the storm. They had escaped the Cyclones. They had resisted the lotus. But their journey was still only beginning. Odysseus stood near the front of his ship. The wind moved through his hair. The sea stretched endlessly ahead. He wondered how long the journey would take. He had no way of knowing. The gods had not told him how many islands lay between him and Ithaca. They had not told him how many years would pass. He could only continue. The sailors adjusted the sails. The ship moved steadily forward. At night, the sea became dark beneath the stars. The men rested wherever they could. Some slept beside the oars. Others remained awake to watch the horizon. Odysseus often stayed awake longer than the others. He had become responsible for every man aboard. Every decision could mean life or death. The memory of the Cyclops remained with him. He had told his men to leave. They had delayed. People had died. The Lotus-Eaters had given him another lesson. Rest could become a trap. Now he was determined not to make the same mistake again. The journey continued. The days became longer. The sun rose. The sun disappeared. The moon crossed the sky. And still Ithaca remained beyond the horizon. Eventually, the sailors began to notice something in the distance. A dark shape appeared against the sky. At first it looked like an ordinary island, but as they approached, the land grew larger. Rocky cliffs rose above the sea. The shoreline appeared rough. Mountains stood farther inland. The men wondered who lived there. Odysseus studied the island. There was something unusual about it. The land seemed wild. There were no obvious settlements near the coast. No friendly people waiting on the shore. No signs of farms or villages. The sailors became cautious. They slowed the ship. Odysseus ordered them to look carefully. Perhaps there was fresh water. Perhaps there was food. Perhaps there was a safe harbor. But perhaps there was something else. They anchored near the coast. The men waited. The sun moved lower in the sky. They could hear the waves breaking against the rocks. A bird called somewhere inland. Otherwise, the island was silent. Odysseus decided to wait until morning. The men made themselves comfortable aboard the ship. Some prepared food. Others repaired damaged equipment. The sea remained calm, and for a brief moment, everything seemed peaceful again. But during the night, Odysseus could not sleep. He looked toward the dark island. He wondered what lived there. There were stories among sailors of strange peoples and distant islands. Some stories were probably exaggerated. Others might have contained truth. The ancient world was full of places that Greeks knew almost nothing about. Beyond the familiar seas were lands that had never been mapped, and among those lands were creatures that belonged more to legend than to ordinary human life. Odysseus did not know that the island ahead was home to one of the most famous creatures in all of Greek mythology, a Cyclops. The Greeks knew the Cyclopes as enormous beings with tremendous strength, and unlike ordinary men, they had only one eye. The island belonged to a race of these creatures. The sailors did not know this yet. All they knew was that the land seemed strangely quiet. The next morning, Odysseus gathered his men. He told them that they would explore the island, but he would not take everyone. Some would remain with the ships. Others would accompany him. Odysseus wanted to know what kind of place they had reached. The men prepared themselves. Weapons were checked. Food was packed. Wine was carried. They stepped ashore. The landscape was beautiful in places. Wild grass covered the ground. Trees grew between the rocks. There were signs of animals. The men discovered caves and paths leading deeper into the island. Eventually, they found something that caught their attention. A massive cave. Its entrance was enormous. The stone opening was large enough for several men to walk through side by side. Inside, they saw signs of life. There were baskets, animal skins, containers, large piles of cheese. The sailors looked at one another. Someone lived here, and whoever lived here was enormous. The size of the objects was unlike anything they had seen in an ordinary human home. Odysseus's companions wanted to take the food and leave. They believed that whoever owned the cave might return. Odysseus hesitated. He was curious. He wanted to meet the inhabitant. Perhaps the stranger would offer them hospitality. The Greeks believed that travelers were protected by the gods. A host was expected to welcome a stranger, provide food, and offer shelter. Odysseus wondered whether the creature living in the cave would follow the same customs. He would soon discover that the laws of hospitality meant nothing to a Cyclops. The men entered the cave. The interior was enormous. The ceiling disappeared into darkness. The walls were rough stone. The smell of animals filled the air. There were sheep and goats moving around the cave. The Greeks gathered near the entrance. They waited. Hours passed. Then they heard footsteps, slow, heavy. Each step seemed to shake the ground. The men stopped speaking. They looked toward the entrance. A shadow appeared, then another step. The sound grew louder. The creature entered. He was enormous, much taller than any human being. His body was powerful and covered with rough hair. But the most frightening thing about him was his face. In the center of his forehead was a single enormous eye. The sailors froze. The Cyclops looked at them. He looked at the animals. Then he looked at the entrance. He had discovered strangers inside his home. The creature's name was Polyphemus. He was the son of Poseidon, and this meeting would change the entire course of Odysseus's journey. Polyphemus placed a huge stone across the entrance of the cave. The stone was so large that the Greeks could not move it. They were trapped. Odysseus stepped forward. He spoke to the Cyclops. He asked him to respect the laws of hospitality. He explained that they were travelers. They had come from the war at Troy. They were trying to return home. They asked for food and shelter. Polyphemus listened. Then he laughed. He did not fear the gods. He did not care about the laws of hospitality. He asked where Odysseus's ship was. Odysseus understood the danger. He did not tell him. He said that the ship had been destroyed by the sea. It was a lie. His real ship was hidden nearby. Polyphemus stared at him. Then he moved toward the sailors. And Odysseus realized that the journey had entered a new kind of danger. The Lotus-Eaters had offered forgetfulness. The Cyclops offered something much darker. There would be no easy escape. The men were inside a cave. The entrance was blocked by a stone that no ordinary human could move. Their enemy was enormous, and the creature before them was the son of the god who ruled the sea. Odysseus looked at his companions. He understood that courage alone would not save them. They would need intelligence. They would need patience. And above all, they would need to survive. The great journey home had only just begun. And on that distant island, beneath the shadow of a gigantic cave, Odysseus was about to face the most famous challenge of his voyage, Polyphemus, the one-eyed Cyclops, and the battle of wits that would make the name of Odysseus famous for thousands of years. The cave became completely silent. Odysseus and his companions stood together in the darkness, watching the enormous figure of Polyphemus move among his animals. The Cyclops was unlike any human being they had ever encountered. He was enormous, powerful, and completely at home in the wilderness. He lived without cities, without laws, and without the customs that governed the lives of ordinary Greek communities. There were no streets on his island, no marketplace, no palace, no assembly where men gathered to discuss laws. The Cyclops lived alone with his animals, depending on the land around him, and caring little for the world beyond it. And now a group of strangers had entered his home. Odysseus understood that the situation was dangerous. The men had expected hospitality. They had entered the cave believing that its owner might welcome them as travelers. Instead, they had discovered something entirely different. Polyphemus did not think like a Greek. He did not recognize the sacred obligation to protect strangers. He did not fear the gods who watched over travelers. He did not care that Odysseus had fought at Troy. To him, the men were simply creatures who had entered his cave without permission. Polyphemus looked at them one by one. Then he asked again where their ship was. Odysseus kept his answer hidden. He told the Cyclops that their ship had been destroyed by the sea. The lie was necessary. If Polyphemus knew that the ship was nearby, he might destroy it and remove every possibility of escape. The Cyclops said nothing for a moment. Then he reached toward two of the sailors. The men tried to move away, but Polyphemus was too strong. He seized them. The others watched in horror. Odysseus wanted to act. His hand moved toward his sword, but he stopped. He looked toward the enormous stone blocking the entrance. It was impossible to move. Even if they attacked Polyphemus, they would still be trapped inside. A sword could wound a man. It could not move a mountain. Odysseus understood that the first impulse of a warrior, to attack, would not save them. They needed another plan. The night passed slowly. The Greeks remained trapped inside the cave. Polyphemus slept. The enormous stone remained across the entrance. The sailors whispered among themselves. Some were afraid. Some prayed. Others looked toward Odysseus, waiting for him to decide what they should do. Odysseus did not sleep. He examined the cave. He studied everything: the walls, the animals, the wooden objects, the entrance, the stone, the fire. And then he noticed something. A massive wooden club lay nearby. It was not merely a walking stick. It was a huge piece of tree trunk, thick enough that several men would have struggled to lift it. Odysseus stared at it. An idea began to form. He could not defeat Polyphemus with ordinary weapons. But perhaps he could use the Cyclops' own strength against him. Still, there was another problem. Even if they injured the creature, how would they escape? The stone remained. The entrance remained blocked. And Polyphemus would know immediately who had attacked him. Odysseus continued thinking. The night seemed endless. Outside, the sea moved gently against the shore. Inside the cave, the sailors waited in silence. Eventually, dawn arrived. A faint light appeared around the edges of the stone. Polyphemus woke. He moved toward the animals. He opened the cave enough to allow his flock to pass outside. Then he rolled the enormous stone away. The Greeks watched carefully. For a moment, Odysseus considered attacking, but the opening was too narrow. Polyphemus stood directly in front of it. Even if they managed to kill him, they might still be unable to move the stone. So they waited. The Cyclops led his animals outside. Then he replaced the stone. The Greeks were trapped again. But now Odysseus had time. He began speaking quietly with his men. He explained that they needed a weapon. The huge wooden club could be used, but it was far too large. They would have to cut part of it down. The sailors worked carefully. They cut the wood into a manageable length. Then they sharpened one end. They hid the weapon beneath piles of animal waste and other objects inside the cave. The plan was simple. If they could make Polyphemus sleep deeply, they could drive the sharpened wooden stake into his eye. But even then, escape would depend upon what happened afterward. They waited. Later that day, Polyphemus returned. He entered the cave. The stone was placed across the entrance once more. The men were trapped. Again. The Cyclops looked at them. He asked Odysseus his name. Odysseus remained cautious. He knew that revealing his true identity could be dangerous, so he told the Cyclops that his name was Nobody. Polyphemus laughed. He found the answer strange, but he accepted it. Odysseus then offered him wine. The wine had been brought from the ship. It was strong and sweet. Polyphemus had rarely tasted anything like it. He drank. Then he asked for more. Odysseus gave him another portion. The Cyclops drank again. His enormous body began to relax. His movements became slower. His eye grew heavy. The sailors watched. Odysseus continued offering wine. Polyphemus enjoyed it. He asked again for the stranger's name. Odysseus answered, Nobody. The Cyclops laughed. He said that as a reward for the wine, he would eat Nobody last. Then he fell asleep. The cave became silent. Odysseus looked at his companions. Now, this was their chance. The men uncovered the sharpened wooden stake. Several of them carried it. They moved quietly toward the sleeping Cyclops. The weapon was placed into the fire. The wood began to burn. The end became red, then brighter. Odysseus waited. He watched the flames. He waited until the weapon was hot enough. Then the men lifted it. Together, they approached Polyphemus. The Cyclops slept deeply. Odysseus gave the signal. The men drove the burning stake into the creature's single eye. Polyphemus woke instantly. He screamed. The sound was enormous. It echoed through the cave. The sailors stumbled backward. The Cyclops grabbed at his face. He pulled the burning wood away. His cry could be heard across the island. Other Cyclopes living nearby heard him. They came toward his cave. They called out. They asked what had happened. Polyphemus shouted that nobody was killing him. The other Cyclopes misunderstood. They asked whether someone was attacking him. Polyphemus answered again, Nobody. So they believed that no one was hurting him. They told him that if nobody was attacking him, he should pray to his father Poseidon. Then they left. Odysseus watched from the darkness. His plan had worked. The Cyclops could not see, but the men were still trapped. Polyphemus moved toward the entrance. He rolled the stone aside. He sat there. He intended to catch anyone trying to escape. Odysseus realized that they could not simply run past him. The Cyclops would feel for them. He might kill them before they reached the shore. So once again, Odysseus thought. He looked toward the animals. The sheep, the goats, the enormous flock that Polyphemus released every morning. An idea appeared. The Greeks would hide beneath the animals. When morning came, Polyphemus would allow his flock to leave the cave. He would touch the animals as they passed, but he would not expect men beneath them. The plan required patience. The sailors tied themselves beneath the largest sheep. Odysseus chose the strongest ram for himself. He held tightly beneath the animal. The night passed. Polyphemus remained awake. He sat near the entrance. He could not see, but he listened. Every sound mattered. The Greeks stayed completely silent. Morning came. The animals began moving. One by one, the sheep approached the entrance. Polyphemus touched them. He checked their backs. He wanted to make certain that none of the Greeks were escaping. The first animals passed. Then more. Polyphemus felt the wool. He knew the flock well, but he did not realize that men were hidden underneath. Odysseus waited. His hands held tightly to the ram's wool. The animal moved forward, slowly, past the Cyclops, toward freedom. The other men followed. Eventually, all of them were outside. They did not run immediately. They crawled away from the cave. Then they stood. The sailors looked back. Polyphemus was still inside. They had escaped. They ran toward the ship. The men pushed the vessel into the water. They climbed aboard. The oars entered the sea. The ship moved away from the island. For the first time since entering the cave, they could breathe freely. They had survived. They had escaped a creature that seemed impossible to defeat. Odysseus had used patience, deception, and intelligence. But then something happened. As the ship moved farther from shore, Odysseus looked back. Polyphemus stood near the cliffs. He could hear the ship. He could not see it. Odysseus called out. His companions warned him not to reveal himself. They told him to remain silent. They had escaped. They should leave. But Odysseus was proud. He wanted the Cyclops to know who had defeated him. He shouted his real name. He told Polyphemus that it was Odysseus who had blinded him. The moment the words left his mouth, the danger changed. Polyphemus now knew the identity of his enemy. He raised his hands toward the sky. He prayed to his father. Poseidon! He asked the god of the sea to punish Odysseus. If possible, he prayed, let Odysseus never reach Ithaca, and if he must reach it, let him arrive only after losing all his companions. The prayer was heard. Odysseus had escaped the cave, but he had created a new enemy. Poseidon. The god of the sea would remember his name. The Cyclops then lifted enormous rocks and threw them toward the fleeing ship. The first stone crashed into the water. A wave struck the vessel. The men struggled to keep control. Another rock fell nearby. The sea rose around them. Odysseus ordered the sailors to row. They moved farther away. Eventually, the island became distant. The danger seemed to fade. But Odysseus's companions were angry. They told him that his pride had nearly killed them. He had escaped. They could have left silently. Instead, he had revealed his name. Odysseus understood the danger, but the damage was already done. The ship continued into the open sea. Behind them was the island of the Cyclops. Ahead was the unknown. The men had lost companions. They had angered a powerful god, and they had learned another lesson. Cleverness could save a man, but pride could endanger him again. Odysseus had defeated Polyphemus because he knew when to think instead of fight. Yet the same man who had been patient inside the cave had become reckless once he believed himself safe. His victory had given him confidence, perhaps too much confidence. The sea stretched endlessly before the ship. The sailors looked toward the horizon. Some were grateful to be alive. Others were silent. Odysseus stood alone for a while. He thought about the cave. He thought about the men who had died. He thought about the prayer of Polyphemus. He did not yet know how seriously the god Poseidon would take it. The journey home continued. But now the sea itself seemed different. The waves were no longer merely waves. Every storm could be a message. Every wind could change their direction. Every distant cloud could hide another danger. And somewhere beyond the horizon, Ithaca remained, still waiting, still impossibly far away. The men had survived the Ciconies. They had survived the Lotus-Eaters. They had survived the Cyclops. But their greatest difficulties were still ahead. Soon they would meet a keeper of the winds. They would receive a gift that seemed capable of carrying them directly home. And then, because of a single moment of mistrust, that gift would be lost. The sea would turn against them again, and the long journey of Odysseus would become even longer. The island of the Cyclopes was disappearing behind them. At first, the men of Odysseus could still see the dark outline of its mountains against the horizon. Then the mountains became smaller. The cliffs became shadows. The shoreline disappeared into the haze, and finally there was nothing left but the open sea. The sailors continued rowing. The wind filled the sails. The ship moved steadily away from the island where they had nearly lost their lives. For some time, nobody celebrated. They had survived Polyphemus, but the memory of the cave remained too fresh. The men remembered the enormous stone blocking the entrance. They remembered the single eye of the Cyclops. They remembered the terrible silence that had followed when Polyphemus discovered that he had been blinded. And they remembered the moment when Odysseus had revealed his name. Some of the sailors still wondered why he had done it. They had escaped. They were alive. Their ship was still floating. The danger should have been behind them. But Odysseus had wanted the Cyclops to know who had defeated him. That decision had changed everything. The prayer of Polyphemus now followed them across the sea. His father was Poseidon, and Poseidon was not a god who could easily be forgotten. The Greeks knew the sea as something beautiful and terrifying at the same time. A calm sea could carry a ship safely across hundreds of miles. But the same water could become a wall of destruction when the winds changed. The sea had no roads. There were no signs telling sailors where to turn. A captain had to read the clouds, the currents, the waves, and the wind. A journey could be shortened by favorable weather. It could also be extended for weeks by a single storm. And now Odysseus had angered the god who ruled those waters. He did not know when Poseidon would act. He only knew that the possibility remained. So the ships continued. Days passed, then more days. The men ate the food they had saved. They drank from their remaining water supplies. They repaired ropes and sails damaged during the escape. The sea became their entire world. During the day, there was nothing but blue water beneath a bright sky. At night, there was the darkness of the sea beneath countless stars. Sometimes the sailors could see the constellations clearly. They used them to understand their direction. They watched the movement of the sun. They watched the color of the horizon. Odysseus was constantly thinking. He had learned that the greatest danger was often not the thing directly in front of him. It was the thing he could not yet see. The men began to ask how far they were from Ithaca. Odysseus could not give them a certain answer. The sea had already carried them far from their intended route. The storm after the land of the Ciconas had scattered their fleet. The island of the Lotus-Eaters had delayed them. The Cyclops had nearly destroyed them. And now their course was uncertain. Still, they continued. Every sailor aboard had the same hope. Perhaps the next sunrise would reveal Ithaca. Perhaps the next coastline would be home. Perhaps they would finally see the hills of their island. Perhaps they would walk through the familiar streets again. That hope kept them moving. Then, one day, the sailors saw land. It appeared on the horizon like a dark line. As they approached, the shape became clearer. An island. But unlike the wild land of the Cyclopes, this island seemed organized. There were fields. There were settlements. There were signs that people lived there in large numbers. Odysseus watched carefully. The island was known as Aeolia. It was the home of Aeolus, the keeper of the winds. The Greeks believed that the winds were not simply movements of air. They were powers. They could carry ships. They could destroy forests. They could raise waves. They could scatter armies. And Aeolus was said to have been given authority over them. He could release them. He could restrain them. He could allow one wind to blow while keeping another imprisoned. The island itself seemed almost magical. It was surrounded by enormous bronze walls. According to the ancient tradition, Aeolus lived there with his family. The winds were kept under control, allowing him to guide their movement. When Odysseus and his ships arrived, Aeolus welcomed them. This was a very different kind of encounter from the one they had experienced with Polyphemus. There was no enormous creature waiting in a cave. There was no immediate threat. Instead, they found hospitality. Aeolus received Odysseus as a guest. He listened to the story of the Trojan War. He listened to the story of the long journey. He heard about the storm. He heard about the Cyclones. He heard about the Lotus-Eaters. And eventually, he heard about the Cyclops. Odysseus told him about Polyphemus. He told him how the Cyclops had trapped the Greeks. He explained how they had escaped. And perhaps he also told him about the curse of Poseidon. Aeolus listened. He understood the difficulty of the journey. The king of Ithaca was trying to return home. His companions had suffered. They had lost friends. They had been carried far from their intended course. They were exhausted. Aeolus decided to help. The Greeks remained on Aeolia for a period of time. For the first time since leaving Troy, Odysseus and his companions experienced something close to comfort. They ate. They drank. They slept. They repaired the ships. They rested their bodies. They spoke with the people of the island. For a while, the journey seemed almost peaceful. Odysseus could finally allow himself to relax. But the thought of Ithaca never disappeared. Even when he rested, he was thinking about home. He imagined Penelope. He imagined his son. He imagined the land he had left behind. Years had passed since he had seen them. Telemachus had been a child when Odysseus left. Now he was growing into a young man. Odysseus wondered what his son had become. Would Telemachus remember him clearly? Would Penelope still believe that he would return? Would Ithaca still feel like home after so many years? These thoughts remained inside him. Aeolus eventually asked Odysseus what he needed. Odysseus explained that the greatest obstacle was the journey itself. He needed a favorable wind. He needed something that would carry his ships directly toward Ithaca. Aeolus agreed to help. He gathered the winds. The ancient Greeks imagined that the winds had different personalities and directions. There were winds from the north, winds from the south, winds from the east, winds from the west. Each could change the condition of the sea. Each could alter the fate of a ship. Aeolus gathered them and contained them. Then he placed them inside a large leather bag. Only the wind that would help Odysseus was allowed to blow freely. The others were trapped inside. Aeolus gave the bag to Odysseus. He warned him carefully. The bag must remain closed. If it remained sealed, the winds would not escape. The ship would receive a favorable breeze. The journey would be quick. Odysseus accepted the gift. He thanked Aeolus. The ships departed. The wind began pushing them toward Ithaca. For the first time in a very long time, the voyage seemed easy. The sea was calm. The sails were full. The ships moved steadily. The sailors watched the horizon. Odysseus remained near the deck. He kept the bag close. The wind blew from the correct direction. The ships continued. Days passed. The coastline of Ithaca was still far away, but now it seemed possible. The sailors began to become hopeful. They started speaking about home. They imagined what they would do when they arrived. Some talked about their wives. Others imagined their children. Some dreamed of sleeping in their own beds. The atmosphere aboard the ships changed. They were no longer simply surviving. They were approaching the end. Or so they believed. Odysseus watched the sea. The distance between them and Ithaca became smaller. One day, then another, then another. The island should soon appear. But Odysseus was exhausted. He had spent years fighting, years traveling, years making decisions. The constant responsibility had begun to weigh upon him. He had to decide where to sail. He had to protect his men. He had to watch the weather. He had to remain awake when storms threatened. Now, with the favorable wind carrying them home, he finally believed that the journey was almost over. He relaxed. He allowed himself to sleep. It was perhaps the first time in a very long time that he slept without believing that he might immediately need to make a decision. The sailors continued their work. They watched the sea. They watched Odysseus sleeping. They watched the mysterious leather bag beside him. They knew Aeolus had given it to their leader, but they did not know exactly what was inside. Odysseus had not explained everything. He had simply told them that the bag contained something important. The sailors became curious. Then suspicion began. They looked toward Odysseus. They looked at the bag. They looked toward the horizon. They could almost see the end of the journey. And yet they wondered, why had Aeolus given Odysseus such a valuable gift? What was inside the bag? Was it treasure? Gold? Jewels? Something precious that Aeolus had given only to the king? The sailors began whispering among themselves. They had been traveling with Odysseus for years. They had suffered alongside him. They had fought alongside him. They believed they deserved their share of whatever wealth had been gained. Some began to feel jealous. They looked at the possessions Odysseus had gathered during the journey. They remembered the treasures taken from Troy. They wondered whether he was hiding even more. The closer they came to Ithaca, the stronger their suspicion became. One sailor might have said that Odysseus was keeping everything for himself. Another might have wondered why he had been sleeping while they continued working. The whispers spread. Odysseus remained asleep. The bag rested beside him. The sea was calm. The ship moved toward home. Then slowly, the coastline of Ithaca appeared. It was faint. At first only a dark shape, then mountains, then hills, then the familiar outline of the island. They were there. After years of wandering, they had finally reached Ithaca. The sailors saw it, their hearts filled with excitement. They began pointing toward the land. Some cried out, some laughed. Some could not believe that the journey was finally ending. The ship moved closer. Odysseus remained asleep. The sailors looked at one another. They believed they had reached home. Then someone looked again at the leather bag. The suspicion became unbearable. They believed Odysseus had been given treasure. They thought perhaps he had hidden it from them. They wondered what would happen when they reached Ithaca. Would Odysseus keep the wealth for himself? Would he reward only the men closest to him? Would the rest receive nothing? Their jealousy overcame their caution. One of them approached the bag. He hesitated. He knew that Odysseus had ordered it to remain closed, but he believed that the contents belonged to all of them. Perhaps he convinced himself that opening it would cause no harm. Perhaps he thought they could take only a little. Perhaps he simply wanted to know what was inside. He touched the leather. He looked toward Odysseus. The king was still asleep. The sailor loosened the fastening. The bag opened. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then the winds escaped. The calm sea changed instantly. The sky darkened. A violent wind burst across the water. The sails snapped. The ship tilted. The sailors screamed. The winds that Aeolus had imprisoned for so long were suddenly free. They rushed across the sea with tremendous force. The ship was thrown backward. The coastline of Ithaca disappeared. The men struggled to hold the ropes. Some fell across the deck. Others grabbed the mast. The wind tore through the sails. The sea rose around them. Odysseus woke. For a moment, he did not understand what was happening. Then he saw the open bag. He understood. The winds were gone. The gift of Aeolus had been destroyed by their own carelessness. Odysseus looked toward the horizon. Ithaca had disappeared. They had been so close that they could see the island. And now the sea was carrying them away again. The sailors were devastated. They tried to close the bag, but the winds had already escaped. The ship was powerless. It was carried farther and farther from Ithaca. Odysseus stood on the deck. He could barely speak. The island had been within reach. Home had been there. After years of wandering, they had almost touched the end of their journey, and now they were being taken away again. The sailors realized what they had done. Their jealousy had destroyed the chance to return home. They had believed the bag contained treasure. Instead, it had contained the winds. Their own suspicion had undone them. The storm continued. The ship was carried far away. Eventually, after the winds weakened, the sea became calmer, but Ithaca was gone. The sailors were exhausted. Odysseus was devastated. They had lost their way again. Still, he did not abandon hope. The ships continued. They eventually returned to Aeolia. Odysseus believed Aeolus might help them again. Perhaps the Keeper of the Winds would understand. Perhaps he would give them another favorable wind. Perhaps the journey could begin again. They approached the island. They sailed toward the familiar shores. Odysseus went to Aeolus. He explained what had happened. He told him that the winds had escaped. He told him that they had almost reached Ithaca. He asked for another chance. Aeolus listened, but something had changed. The gods had already begun to turn against Odysseus. Aeolus believed that a man whom the gods hated could not safely be helped. He refused. He told Odysseus to leave. The journey was now his own responsibility. Odysseus returned to the ship. The sailors watched silently. They had nothing to say. They had been so close. Now they were once again strangers on the sea. The ships left Aeolia. The island disappeared behind them. Odysseus looked forward. He knew that no gift would save them now. No easy wind would carry them home. No friendly island would guarantee their safety. They would have to continue. The sea became their prison. Their home remained far away, and the consequences of the opened bag would follow them. The next place they reached would be very different from Aeolia. It would not be a peaceful island. It would not be a place of hospitality. Instead, they would encounter beings of enormous strength, a people who could destroy ships almost as easily as a man could break a branch. The journey would become darker. The fleet would suffer another devastating loss. And once again, Odysseus would watch the number of his companions grow smaller. The voyage home was no longer simply difficult. It was becoming a test of endurance. One by one, the people who had left Troy with him were disappearing, and Odysseus was beginning to understand the terrible truth of his journey. He might reach Ithaca, but there was no guarantee that anyone else would. The sea carried the ships onward. The wind moved across the water. The sun disappeared. Night arrived. Odysseus remained awake. He looked toward the stars. Somewhere beyond them was Ithaca. Somewhere there was Penelope. Somewhere there was Telemachus. But between Odysseus and his home stood an entire world of storms, monsters, gods, and unknown lands. And the journey was still far from over. The ships continued across the open sea. Behind them was Aeolia. Behind Aeolia was the painful memory of Ithaca disappearing from sight. The men had been so close. They had already imagined stepping onto their homeland. They had imagined seeing their families. They had imagined the end of the long voyage. And then, in a single moment, the winds had carried them away. Now there was nothing to do except continue. The sailors became quieter. The laughter that had once filled the ships was gone. The men had begun to understand that every hope of reaching home could disappear without warning. They had seen it happen before. The Cyclones had taken their companions. The Lotus-Eaters had nearly taken their memories. The Cyclops had nearly taken their lives. And now the winds had taken their chance to return home. Odysseus stood at the front of the ship and watched the horizon. He did not know how long the next stage of the journey would last. He only knew that they had to keep moving. The fleet sailed onward. Days passed. The men became accustomed to the rhythm of the sea once again. At dawn, they raised the sails. During the day, they watched the water. At night, they rested beneath the stars. The ships moved slowly through a world that seemed almost endless. Sometimes dolphins appeared beside the vessels. Sometimes seabirds followed them. Sometimes the sea was so calm that the ships seemed to float upon a sheet of glass. At other times, the waves rose and forced the sailors to work through the night. Odysseus continued to guide them. He had become accustomed to uncertainty. He had learned that the sea rarely gave a warning before changing. But after the loss of the favorable winds, something else had changed. The men no longer trusted their own luck. Every island looked suspicious. Every unfamiliar coastline raised questions. They wondered who lived there. They wondered whether they would be welcomed. They wondered whether the next place would become another disaster. Eventually, they saw land again. The coastline rose ahead of them. It was larger than the islands they had previously encountered. Tall mountains stood behind the shore. Dark cliffs reached toward the sea. A mist hung above the water. The men were tired. Their supplies were becoming limited. They needed food. They needed water. They needed a safe place to rest. Odysseus studied the coastline. He decided that they would approach carefully. The ships moved toward the shore. The land seemed strangely quiet. There were no obvious villages, no fields, no temples, no people waiting near the water, yet there were signs of life. Smoke could be seen in the distance. Birds flew above the cliffs. Somewhere inland, animals moved through the forests. Odysseus sent scouts to investigate. The men stepped ashore. They walked through the unfamiliar land. Eventually, they encountered a woman. She was enormous. Her size immediately frightened them. She was not simply a large human being. She seemed to belong to a race of giants. The scouts hesitated. The woman spoke to them. She told them that her father was the king of the land. She directed them toward the palace. The Greeks were uncertain, but they followed. Perhaps the people were peaceful. Perhaps the strange appearance of the woman was simply a feature of the local people. They continued inland. Soon they reached a great settlement. The houses were large. The roads were wide. The people who lived there were enormous. The Greeks realized that they had entered the land of the Laestrygonians. They were a race of giant cannibalistic beings. The sailors did not know this immediately. They only knew that the people were much larger than themselves. They approached the palace. Inside was the king. His name was Antiphates. He looked upon the strangers. The Greeks explained that they were travelers. They asked for food and hospitality, but the king did not welcome them. Instead, he called for his people. The Greeks suddenly realized that something was wrong. One of the men tried to escape. Another turned toward the shore. The situation changed instantly. The giant king seized one of the sailors. The man screamed. The Laestrygonians surrounded him. They were enormous. They moved quickly. The Greeks ran. They realized that they had entered a trap. The scouts raced toward the ships. Odysseus shouted for everyone to return. The men ran through the streets. Behind them, the giants followed. The Greeks reached the harbor. They climbed aboard their ships. They cut the ropes. They pushed away from the shore. But the harbor itself was a deadly trap. The cliffs surrounding it were steep. The entrance was narrow. The ships had sailed too far inside. The Laestrygonians stood on the cliffs above them. They began throwing enormous rocks down toward the vessels. The first stone struck a ship. Wood shattered. Men fell into the water. Another rock crashed down. Another ship was destroyed. The sailors screamed. There was nowhere to hide. The giants continued throwing stones. They also hurled burning objects toward the ships. The harbor became filled with smoke. The sea was crowded with broken timber. Men tried to swim, but the Laestrygonians entered the water. They seized sailors. They dragged them away. The Greeks fought desperately, but there were too many giants, and the ships were trapped. Odysseus understood that there was only one chance. His ship had remained outside the deepest part of the harbor. He ordered his men to cut the anchor lines. The oars entered the water. They rowed with all their strength. The ship moved toward the narrow entrance. Behind them, the rest of the fleet was being destroyed. Odysseus looked back. He could see ships breaking apart. He could see men struggling in the water. He could hear the screams of his companions, but he could not turn back. If he did, his own ship would be destroyed as well. The oars struck the water, again and again. The sailors pulled with everything they had. The ship moved through the entrance. They escaped the harbor, but only one ship survived. The entire fleet was gone. All the other ships had been destroyed. Thousands of years later, the story would remain one of the darkest moments in the Odyssey. Odysseus had begun the journey with many ships. Now only one remained. The men aboard it were silent. They looked back toward the distant land. Some had brothers among the dead. Some had friends. Some had fought beside those men at Troy. Now they were gone. Odysseus felt the weight of their loss. He had survived again. But survival was becoming increasingly lonely. The sea stretched around the single remaining ship. The men no longer had the comfort of a fleet. There were no other sails on the horizon, no companion ships, no second vessel to rescue them if disaster came. Only one ship remained between Odysseus and the sea. He knew that from this point forward, every decision would be even more important. The men could not afford another disaster. There were no replacements, no additional supplies, no other ships waiting nearby. The journey had been reduced to its simplest form. One ship, one captain, a small group of exhausted sailors, and a distant home. Odysseus ordered the men to continue. They left the land of the Laestrygonians behind. The coastline slowly disappeared. The sea became empty again. The men sailed without speaking. Some prayed, some cried quietly. Others simply stared toward the horizon. Odysseus remained at the front. He thought about the men who had been lost. He thought about Troy. When the war had ended, there had been so many ships, so many men, so much confidence. They had believed the journey home would be easy compared with the war. They had been wrong. The war had lasted 10 years. But the journey home was becoming another war. Only now, the enemy was not an army. It was the sea. It was hunger. It was fear. It was exhaustion. It was the anger of the gods. And sometimes, it was their own weakness. Odysseus wondered how many more companions would remain when they finally reached Ithaca. He did not say the question aloud. Perhaps he was afraid of the answer. The ship continued. Days became weeks. The sailors repaired the damage caused by the journey. They collected rainwater. They rationed food. They caught fish whenever possible. They watched the sky carefully. They had learned to fear clouds. A dark cloud could mean a storm. A sudden wind could change their direction. A calm sea could hide danger beneath its surface. The men became experienced sailors. They had no choice. They learned how to read the waves. They learned how to tighten ropes. They learned how to control the sails. They learned to recognize changes in the wind. Every day at sea taught them something. But the most important lesson was endurance. They had to continue. Even when they were afraid, even when they were tired, even when they wanted to stop, because there was nowhere else to go. Then, one evening, they saw an island. It appeared in the distance beneath the setting sun. Unlike the land of the Laestrygonians, this island looked peaceful. Green hills rose gently from the sea. Trees covered the slopes. A faint smoke rose from somewhere inland. The sailors watched it carefully. Odysseus wondered whether they should approach. They needed food. They needed fresh water. The men were exhausted. They could not remain forever on the open sea. So Odysseus decided to investigate. The ship moved toward the shore. The water near the island was calm. There were no cliffs, no narrow harbor, no signs of enormous inhabitants. The sailors felt some relief. They anchored. Odysseus selected a small group to explore. The men stepped ashore. They discovered a beautiful island. Wild flowers grew among the grass. Streams ran through the valleys. Animals moved through the forests. It seemed like a place untouched by war. Then they noticed smoke rising from a distant house. Someone lived there. The Greeks approached carefully. They did not know that the woman waiting inside would become one of the most important figures in Odysseus's journey. Her name was Circe. She was not an ordinary woman. She was a powerful goddess or enchantress. She lived alone on the island of Aeolus, and when Odysseus's men approached her home, they believed they had finally found another place of safety. They were wrong. Circe's palace stood in a beautiful clearing. Around it were wild animals, lions, wolves, but these animals did not attack the visitors. Instead, they moved calmly around the palace. The Greeks found this strange. They did not know that these animals had once been men. Circe had transformed them. The sailors approached the palace. They were tired. They had no reason to believe that another great danger was waiting for them. They called out. Circe heard them. She opened the doors. She welcomed them. She offered them food and drink. The men accepted. They had learned to be cautious, but hunger was stronger than fear. They entered. They sat at the table. Circe served them. The food was rich. The wine was sweet. The sailors relaxed. Then Circe raised her cup. She spoke words they did not understand, and the men began to change. Their bodies twisted. Their human forms disappeared. They became animals. Some became pigs. Others were transformed into different creatures. Their minds remained human. They could remember who they were. They could remember Odysseus. They could remember the sea, but their bodies were no longer their own. Circe had transformed them. The men who had entered her palace as sailors now moved on 4 legs. They cried out, but their voices could no longer be understood. The transformation was complete. One man escaped. He ran back toward the ship. He was terrified. He told Odysseus what had happened. Odysseus listened. He realized that another challenge had begun. But this time, the enemy was not a giant, not an army, not the sea. It was magic. Odysseus prepared to enter Circe's palace himself. He knew that his men were trapped. He could not abandon them. He could not sail away. So he stepped onto the island. He walked toward the palace. On the way, he encountered a strange young man. The stranger was actually the god Hermes. Hermes warned Odysseus about Circe. He explained what she would attempt. Then he gave Odysseus a magical plant known as Molly. The plant would protect him from Circe's spell. Hermes also explained that when Circe tried to transform him, Odysseus should draw his sword and threaten her. But he should not harm her. He should force her to swear an oath that she would no longer try to deceive him. Odysseus listened. Then he continued toward the palace. Circe opened the doors. She invited him inside. She offered him wine. Odysseus accepted. He drank. Circe watched. She expected the spell to work. She spoke her magic, but nothing happened. Odysseus remained human. Circe was shocked. She realized that this stranger was protected. Odysseus drew his sword. He threatened her. Circe stepped backward. She understood that she had met someone different, someone who could resist her magic. She asked who he was. Odysseus told her. He was the man whose name had already begun to travel through the world. Odysseus, the survivor of Troy, the man who had blinded Polyphemus, the wanderer whom the sea had failed to destroy. Circe recognized him. She understood that the prophecy and rumors surrounding him had finally brought him to her island. She swore that she would not harm him. Then she reversed the spell. The men returned to their human forms. They were weak at first, confused, but alive. Odysseus had saved them. The sailors were relieved, but they did not immediately leave the island. Circe offered them food. This time, the food was safe. The men rested. They slept. For the first time in a long while, they found a place where they could recover. Days passed, then weeks. The sailors repaired the ship. They gathered supplies. They hunted. They rested. Odysseus remained with Circe. The island was peaceful. The dangers of the sea seemed far away. But Odysseus had not forgotten Ithaca. He still wanted to go home. Eventually, he told Circe that they had to leave. They had already spent too long on Aeolus. Circe understood. But before Odysseus could continue toward Ithaca, she told him something important. The path home would not be simple. He needed knowledge. He needed to learn what the gods had planned. He needed to speak with someone who could tell him the way. There was only one place where he could obtain that knowledge: the realm of the dead. Odysseus would have to travel to the Underworld. He would have to cross the boundary between the living and the dead. There, he would seek the spirit of Tiresias, the famous blind prophet of Thebes. The prophet could tell him what lay ahead, but reaching the Underworld would require another journey, another sea, another unknown place. Odysseus listened. He had already faced the Cyclops. He had survived the Laestrygonians. He had watched his fleet disappear. He had resisted the magic of Circe. But the next destination would be unlike anything he had encountered. He would not be sailing toward another island. He would be sailing toward darkness, toward the place where the dead lived. The sailors listened as Circe explained what they must do. They would have to travel toward the far western edge of the known world. There, beyond the ordinary lands of men, was a place where the boundary between life and death was thin. Odysseus would perform a ritual. He would call the dead, and among them he would seek Tiresias. The men were frightened. They had fought armies. They had faced monsters. But the idea of willingly entering the world of the dead terrified them. Still, Odysseus had no choice. If he wanted to reach Ithaca, he needed to know what awaited him. So the preparations began. The ship was repaired. The supplies were gathered. The sailors prepared themselves. The peaceful days on Aeolus were coming to an end. Odysseus stood on the shore and looked toward the sea. The island had given him rest. It had given him back his companions. It had given him time to recover. But it could not give him the one thing he wanted most: home. Ithaca was still waiting. And somewhere beyond the horizon was the next stage of his journey. The ship left Aeolus. The sailors looked back at the island. Circe remained behind. The shore slowly disappeared. Odysseus turned toward the open sea. The sun was lowering. The water became dark. The men said little. They knew where they were going. They were going toward the land of the dead. And as the final light disappeared from the horizon, Odysseus understood that his journey had entered a completely different world. He had already learned that the sea could separate a man from home. Now he was about to discover that even death could stand between a man and the people he loved. The oars moved through the dark water. The ship sailed west, toward the edge of the known world, toward the kingdom of shadows, toward the voice of a prophet who alone could tell Odysseus whether he would ever see Ithaca again. The ship continued westward. Behind Odysseus lay the island of Aeolus, with its forests, its quiet shores, and the palace of Circe. Ahead lay a place that no living man willingly visited, the Underworld. The sailors knew what Circe had told them. They knew that the journey would take them beyond the familiar lands of the living. They knew that Odysseus intended to call upon the dead, and although the men had faced many dangers since leaving Troy, this was different. A warrior could raise a spear against another warrior. A sailor could fight a storm. A clever man could deceive a monster. But how could a living man defend himself against the dead? The question remained in the minds of the sailors as they sailed. The sea was unusually quiet. The wind moved gently across the surface. There were no storms, no enormous waves, no strange creatures, and yet the silence itself seemed unsettling. The sailors had become accustomed to danger arriving with noise. Now there was almost nothing, only the sound of the oars, the creaking of wood, the quiet movement of water against the hull, and the occasional call of a seabird disappearing into the distance. Odysseus remained near the front of the ship. He was thinking about what Circe had told him. The prophet Tiresias was dead, yet his spirit still possessed knowledge. If Odysseus could reach him, the prophet could reveal what lay ahead. Perhaps he could tell Odysseus how to reach Ithaca. Perhaps he could explain why the gods continued to delay him. Perhaps he could tell him whether he would ever see Penelope again. But knowledge had a price. Odysseus would have to enter the realm of the dead. The journey continued. The light gradually changed. The sailors noticed that the landscape around them became darker. The sky seemed heavier. The waters grew colder. The ordinary signs of life became less common. There were fewer birds, fewer animals, no settlements, no distant fires. The world seemed to be emptying. Odysseus knew they were approaching the place described by Circe, the edge of the known world, a place where the sun seemed weak, a place where the living and the dead were believed to come close together. The sailors lowered their voices. They did not know what awaited them. Eventually, they reached the shore. The land was dark. There were trees growing in strange shapes. Mist moved along the ground. The air felt cold. The sailors brought the ship close to shore. Odysseus stepped onto the land. He carried the instructions given to him by Circe. He had to perform the ritual exactly. The dead would not simply appear because he called them. They needed a reason to approach. They needed offerings. They needed blood. Odysseus and his men prepared the place. A trench was dug into the ground. Wine was poured. Milk and honey were offered. Barley was scattered. Then Odysseus called upon the dead. He promised offerings. He asked them to come. At first, nothing happened. The land remained silent. The wind barely moved. Odysseus waited. Then something changed. A shadow appeared. Then another. Figures began moving through the darkness. The dead were coming. They approached slowly. Some appeared as distant shadows. Others looked almost like people Odysseus had once known. But they were not truly alive. They were spirits. They had crossed the boundary that no ordinary living man could cross. Odysseus was frightened, but he remained at the ritual place. He had come for one reason. Tiresias, the prophet, appeared. His spirit approached the blood. Odysseus recognized him. Tiresias told him that he had come because Odysseus needed knowledge. The king of Ithaca asked about his journey. He asked whether he would return home. Tiresias warned him. The journey would continue. The sea would remain dangerous. The gods were not finished with him. Poseidon still held anger against him because of Polyphemus, but Odysseus could reach Ithaca. There was a path home. It would not be easy. The prophet told him that one of the greatest dangers ahead would come from the island of the sun god. The cattle there must not be harmed. Odysseus must control his men. If they respected the animals, they might survive. If they did not, disaster would follow. Tiresias also spoke of Ithaca. When Odysseus finally reached home, he would not find the island exactly as he had left it. His household had changed. His enemies had entered his home. Men who believed that Odysseus was dead had begun seeking Penelope's hand in marriage. They had consumed his food. They had taken his wealth. They had occupied his palace. Odysseus would have to return carefully. He would not simply walk into Ithaca and announce himself. He would have to use his intelligence. He would have to wait. He would have to recognize the right moment. Tiresias then disappeared. Odysseus had received the knowledge he came for. But the underworld was not finished with him. More spirits gathered. Among them were people he had known, friends, warriors, heroes, the dead of Troy. Odysseus saw figures from the past. Some had died during the war. Others had died long before. The world of the dead seemed filled with memories. Odysseus saw his mother. She had died while he was away at Troy. He had not known. The realization struck him deeply. His mother had died while he was fighting. He had never been able to say goodbye. He reached toward her, but he could not embrace her. The dead were not solid like the living. They were shadows, memories, echoes of people who had once walked beneath the sun. Odysseus tried to speak with her. She explained that she had died from sorrow and longing while waiting for him to return. She had waited. She had hoped. But eventually, she had died. Odysseus was overwhelmed. He had spent years trying to reach Ithaca. Now he understood that time had been passing there without him. The world had continued. His family had aged. People he loved had died. Children had grown. Homes had changed. Odysseus had been fighting and wandering while life continued without him. He tried again to embrace his mother, but his hands passed through her. She told him that this was the nature of the dead. The body remained behind. Only the spirit continued. Odysseus mourned, but he could not stay. He still had a journey to complete. The dead continued to gather. Among them were famous warriors. Odysseus saw Agamemnon. The great commander of the Greek forces at Troy had also died. Agamemnon told Odysseus the story of his return. He had reached home. He had believed that the war was over. He had believed that his wife would welcome him, but betrayal awaited him. Agamemnon had been murdered after returning to his palace. His own household had become his grave. The story frightened Odysseus. He thought about Penelope. He wondered what was happening in Ithaca. Could his home also become dangerous? Could those who wanted his wealth take control? Could someone betray him? Tiresias had warned him. Tiresias had warned him. Agamemnon's story made the warning real. A hero could survive 10 years of war and still die after reaching home. Odysseus understood that the final part of a journey could sometimes be the most dangerous. He also encountered Achilles. Achilles had been the greatest warrior of the Greek army. His name had become legendary. During the Trojan War, Odysseus had admired him. Now Achilles was dead. Odysseus spoke to him. He praised his greatness. He spoke about his glory. But Achilles did not celebrate. Instead, he told Odysseus that he would rather be alive as a poor man then rule among the dead. The words were powerful. They revealed something Odysseus had perhaps already begun to understand. Life was precious, even a difficult life, even a life filled with storms and suffering, even a life that required wandering for years. The living still had possibilities. The dead had memories, but no future. Odysseus listened. The journey had changed his understanding of what it meant to return home. At Troy, glory had seemed important. Now home mattered more. He did not want another victory. He did not want another title. He did not want another battlefield. He wanted Ithaca. He wanted Penelope. He wanted to see his son. He wanted to live. The spirits continued to gather. Odysseus saw other heroes and figures from ancient stories. The underworld seemed endless. Every shadow represented a life that had already ended. Every voice carried a memory, and the longer Odysseus remained, the more he felt the pull of the place. The living world seemed distant. The sea seemed distant. Ithaca seemed distant. He remembered Circe's warning. He could not remain. He had to leave before the dead overwhelmed him. Odysseus stepped away. He returned toward the ship. The spirits faded behind him. The darkness remained. Then the first signs of dawn appeared. The sky became slightly lighter. The world of the living returned. Odysseus climbed aboard. His men were waiting. They looked at him. He did not immediately speak. He had seen things that were difficult to explain. He had spoken to the dead. He had seen his mother. He had seen heroes who had fought beside him. He had heard warnings about the future, and he had learned that his home was no longer simply a place waiting for him. It was a place he would have to reclaim. The ship left the shore. The land of the dead disappeared behind them. The sailors watched silently. They were relieved to be leaving. Odysseus looked toward the horizon. The sun began to rise. For the first time in a long while, the light felt comforting. He was alive. And as long as he was alive, he could continue. The ship sailed back toward Aea. Circe was waiting, but Odysseus had changed. The journey to the underworld had shown him something that no monster could teach. The greatest reason to survive was not glory. It was the people waiting at home. And somewhere beyond the sea was Ithaca, still waiting, still calling him back. The ship moved quietly across the morning sea. Behind Odysseus lay the dark shore where he had spoken with the dead. Ahead lay the island of Aeolus. The sailors were exhausted. They had followed their captain into a place that no living man wished to visit, and although they had returned safely, the memory of the underworld remained with them. For Odysseus, the journey had been even more profound. He had seen his mother. He had spoken with Achilles. He had heard the story of Agamemnon's death. He had listened to Tiresias. And he had learned that the road to Ithaca was still filled with danger. But now there was something he possessed that he had not possessed before. Knowledge. The gods might delay him. The sea might scatter him. Monsters might stand in his way. But Odysseus now knew that there was a path home. He only had to survive long enough to follow it. The sailors rowed steadily. The sun climbed higher. The cold darkness of the underworld seemed to retreat behind them. Eventually, the familiar coastline of Aea appeared. The island looked almost impossibly peaceful. Green hills rose beneath the sunlight. The forests moved gently in the breeze. Smoke rose from the palace of Circe. It was difficult to believe that such a peaceful place had been the beginning of their journey into the world of the dead. The ship approached the shore. Circe's servants came to meet them. Food was prepared. Water was brought. The sailors rested. They were exhausted from the voyage. Odysseus entered the palace. Circe was waiting. She knew that he had succeeded. She knew that he had spoken with Tiresias, and she knew that the journey ahead would be dangerous. Odysseus told her what he had learned. He explained the warnings. He explained that he needed to continue. He wanted to know what dangers remained between him and Ithaca. Circe told him. There was still much to endure. The first danger would come from the Sirens. They were creatures whose voices were beautiful beyond anything ordinary men could imagine. Their song could make sailors forget everything. Forget their homes. Forget their families. Forget their own lives. The Sirens did not need weapons. They did not need armies. They simply sang. Their voices were enough. Ships that came too close to their island were drawn toward the rocks. The sailors would hear the song. They would want to know more. They would want to remain near the singers, and they would not realize that their desire was leading them toward death. Odysseus listened carefully. He asked Circe how they could survive. She told him what he must do. The sailors would have to cover their ears with wax. That would prevent them from hearing the song. But Odysseus wanted to hear it. He wanted to know what the Sirens sang. He wanted to experience the temptation and survive it. Circe gave him a solution. His men would tie him tightly to the mast. He would hear the song. He might beg to be released. He might order the sailors to change course. But they must ignore him. They must not loosen the ropes. Only when the ship had passed beyond the reach of the Sirens could they release him. Odysseus agreed. The sailors prepared the ship. The journey resumed. The sea was calm. The island of Circe disappeared behind them. The men knew what was ahead. They prepared pieces of wax. Odysseus watched them. He thought about how strange his life had become. Once he had been king of Ithaca. He had possessed a palace, a wife, a son, a kingdom. Now he was sailing through unknown waters, preparing to tie himself to a mast so that he could hear a deadly song. The sea continued moving beneath the ship. The sailors rowed. The wind filled the sail. And eventually, they saw the island. At first, it looked peaceful, green, beautiful, almost inviting. But the sailors knew what lived there. They placed wax into their ears. Odysseus ordered them to tie him. The ropes were wrapped around his body. He was secured to the mast. He warned them again. No matter what he said, they must not release him. The ship moved closer. The sea became strangely quiet. Then the singing began. The sound traveled across the water. It was beautiful. It was unlike anything Odysseus had ever heard. The Sirens sang of knowledge. They sang as though they knew everything that had happened at Troy. They knew Odysseus. They knew his past. They promised him knowledge of the future. They called to him. Odysseus struggled against the ropes. He wanted to go toward them. He ordered his men to release him. But they could not hear. Their ears were sealed. They continued rowing. Odysseus shouted. He begged. He struggled harder. The sailors only tightened the ropes. The ship moved farther away. The song gradually weakened. The island disappeared behind them. Finally, the sound was gone. Odysseus collapsed against the mast. The sailors removed the ropes. He was free. He had survived. But the experience had shown him something important. Sometimes survival meant refusing to trust even your own desires. A man could know that something was dangerous and still want it. Wisdom was not simply knowing what was right. It was having the strength to act according to that knowledge. The journey continued. The next danger was even more frightening. Circe had warned Odysseus about Scylla and Charybdis. Two dangers stood on opposite sides of a narrow passage. On one side was Charybdis, a monstrous whirlpool. It could swallow enormous quantities of seawater and release them again. Ships that came too close risked being destroyed. On the other side was Scylla, a creature with multiple heads who lived among the rocks. She could reach down toward passing ships and seize sailors. Odysseus had to choose. There was no perfect path. If he moved too close to Charybdis, the entire ship could disappear. If he moved closer to Scylla, some of his men would almost certainly die. Odysseus hated the choice. He wanted to protect everyone. But there were moments when a leader could not create a perfect outcome. He could only choose the path that gave the greatest chance of survival. The ship entered the narrow passage. The sailors looked toward the rocks. The water began to move strangely. Far away, they could hear the roar of Charybdis. Odysseus ordered the men to row. They pulled against the water. Then Scylla appeared. The creature reached down. Her heads moved toward the ship. The sailors screamed. Odysseus watched helplessly. Scylla seized several men. They were lifted from the deck. Their voices disappeared into the darkness. Odysseus wanted to fight. He wanted to save them. But there was nothing he could do. The ship continued forward. The passage opened. They survived. But more men were gone. Odysseus looked at the empty places on the deck. Each disaster left fewer people beside him. The journey home was becoming a journey of loss. Still, they continued. Eventually, they reached an island. The island was sacred to the sun god, Helios. On it lived sacred cattle. Circe had warned Odysseus. Tiresias had warned him. The animals must not be harmed. They were not ordinary cattle. They belonged to the god, Odysseus told his men. They were not to touch them. They could eat the food they had brought. They could catch fish. They could wait. But the cattle must remain untouched. The sailors agreed. Then the weather changed. A storm arrived. The sea became impossible to cross. The ship could not leave. Days passed. The food began to disappear. The sailors grew hungry. Odysseus continued warning them. Do not touch the cattle. Do not kill them. Wait. But hunger is powerful. Eventually, Odysseus fell asleep. His men were starving. They looked toward the cattle. One of them argued that death from hunger was worse than angering the gods. The others listened. The decision was made. They killed the sacred animals. They cooked the meat. They ate. When Odysseus woke, he realized what had happened. He was horrified. He knew the warnings had been ignored. He knew that the gods would not forget. The storm eventually ended. The ship left the island. But their punishment was already coming. The sun god Helios demanded justice. Zeus heard the demand. The gods decided that the sailors would pay for what they had done. As the ship traveled across the sea, the sky darkened. A storm appeared. Lightning struck. The ship was destroyed. The sailors disappeared into the waves. Odysseus alone survived. He clung to the remains of the ship. The sea carried him away. Again, alone. The man who had once commanded a fleet now had nothing. No ships, no army, no companions. Only himself. The sea continued to carry him. Eventually, he reached the island of Calypso, a beautiful island, a peaceful place, a place where Odysseus could rest. And there he would remain for years. Calypso was a goddess. She welcomed Odysseus. She cared for him. She offered him food. She offered him shelter. She wanted him to remain with her. She even offered him immortality. But Odysseus refused. He wanted Ithaca. He wanted Penelope. He wanted the ordinary life of a mortal man. Calypso could give him paradise. But paradise was not home. Years passed. Odysseus sat beside the sea. He watched the horizon. He thought about Ithaca. He wondered whether Penelope still waited. He wondered whether his son remembered him. He wondered whether the world had forgotten him, but he never stopped longing for home. Eventually, the gods intervened. Athena spoke for Odysseus. She asked that he be allowed to leave. Zeus agreed. Calypso could no longer keep him. A raft was prepared. Odysseus gathered supplies. He said goodbye to the island. He sailed away. The sea was calm at first, but Poseidon saw him. The god had not forgotten the curse of Polyphemus. He sent another storm. Waves rose around Odysseus. The raft broke apart. Odysseus was thrown into the sea. He struggled to survive, but Athena protected him. He reached the shore of the land of the Phaeacians. There, exhausted and nearly dead, he collapsed. The Phaeacians found him. They brought him to their city. They gave him food. They gave him clothing. They listened to his story. Odysseus finally found people willing to help him. He told them about Troy. He told them about the Cyclops. He told them about Circe. He told them about the Underworld. He told them about the Sirens. He told them about Scylla and Charybdis. And finally, he told them about the long years he had spent trying to reach home. The Phaeacians were amazed. They had never heard a story like it. They agreed to help him. They prepared a ship. And at last, after 20 years of war and wandering, Odysseus was taken toward Ithaca. The island appeared on the horizon. The hills, the mountains, the familiar coastline. Home. Odysseus could hardly believe it. The Phaeacians carried him ashore while he slept. They placed him on the land. They left gifts beside him. Then they sailed away. When Odysseus woke, he did not immediately recognize the place. Athena appeared. She told him where he was. Ithaca. The word must have felt almost unreal. After everything he had endured, he had finally returned. But the journey was not completely over. Tiresias had warned him. There were men occupying his palace, suitors. They believed Odysseus was dead. They wanted Penelope to choose one of them as her husband. They consumed Odysseus's wealth. They ate his food. They abused the hospitality of his home. They believed the king would never return. Odysseus could not simply walk into the palace. He needed a plan. Athena disguised him as an old beggar. His appearance changed. His clothing became poor. His face became that of an aged wanderer. Nobody would recognize him. He entered Ithaca quietly. His first meeting was with Telemachus. His son had grown into a young man. At first, Telemachus did not know who stood before him. Then Athena revealed the truth. Odysseus told his son who he was. Telemachus could hardly believe it. His father was alive. The man he had spent his entire childhood imagining was standing before him. Father and son embraced. They began planning. The suitors had to be defeated. But they had to act carefully. If Odysseus revealed himself too soon, the suitors could attack. So the king entered his own palace, disguised as a beggar. The suitors mocked him. They did not know whom they were insulting. Penelope saw the stranger. Something about him seemed familiar, but she could not identify him. She spoke about Odysseus. She explained that she had waited for years. She had refused to choose another husband. The suitors had pressured her. They had demanded that she marry one of them. Eventually, Penelope created a test. She announced that she would marry the man who could use Odysseus's great bow. The bow had belonged to the king. The suitors tried. One by one, they failed. The bow was too difficult. Then the disguised Odysseus asked to try. The suitors laughed. They believed a beggar could never do what they could not. Penelope allowed it. Odysseus took the bow. His hands knew it immediately. He had used it before. He bent it. The bow obeyed him. The room became silent. Then he fired. The arrow passed cleanly through the target. The suitors stared. Odysseus dropped the disguise. He revealed himself. The king had returned. The men who had taken his home now understood the truth. The battle began. Telemachus stood beside his father. Their allies joined them. The suitors fought. But Odysseus had spent 20 years surviving war and monsters. These men had no chance. One by one they fell. The palace was reclaimed. The household was restored. But one final person remained, Penelope. She had suffered for 20 years. She had heard countless rumors. She had waited. She had hoped. And she had learned to protect herself through intelligence. She did not immediately accept that the stranger was truly Odysseus. She tested him. She spoke about their bed. The bed that Odysseus had built himself. One of its legs had been carved from a living olive tree. It could not be moved. When Penelope spoke about moving the bed, Odysseus reacted immediately. No stranger could have known. Penelope finally understood. The man before her was Odysseus, her husband, the king of Ithaca, the man she had waited for through 20 years of uncertainty. They embraced. The long journey was finally over. Odysseus had crossed seas. He had faced monsters. He had spoken with the dead. He had lost his companions. He had been imprisoned by a goddess. He had survived storms. He had nearly forgotten home, but he had never stopped trying to return. And now he was home. The story of Odysseus is often remembered as a story about monsters. The Cyclops, the Sirens, Scylla, Charybdis, Circe. But beneath all those adventures is something much simpler. A man wanted to go home. He wanted to return to the people he loved. He wanted to see the land that had shaped him. And the journey taught him that home is not simply a place. It is the memory that keeps a person moving when everything else has been taken away. Odysseus left Troy as a warrior. He returned as something different. He had learned patience. He had learned humility. He had learned that intelligence could save a life, but pride could endanger it. He had learned that the gods could change the direction of a man's life in an instant. And he had learned that even after 20 years, some things could remain unchanged. Penelope had waited. Ithaca had remained. And Odysseus had returned. The sea that had separated him from home had finally released him. The storms had passed. The monsters were behind him. The voices of the dead had grown silent. The long wandering had ended. And somewhere above the quiet island of Ithaca, the night sky stretched peacefully over the land. For the first time in 20 years, Odysseus could sleep without wondering where the next morning would take him. He was home.